Welcome to this introductory video on the wonderful Parliament of 1386 as part of the wider topic area of Richard II's personal rule between 1380 and 1388. This talk is designed to accompany the note-taking sheet which you should have had in class. So there's some information on the potential invasion of England by France, the demands of De la Pole and Richard in the October and the wonderful Parliament of 1386, and the shift of power that occurs as a result of this. At the very bottom of that particular note-taking sheet that you've got, it's important to write down any new key terms that have come up in this particular topic. A reminder that this particular talk as well is just a basic overview. We will be going through stuff in class following it, and in addition, I'd be encouraging you to do that extended reading that's really required for the top students. So some articles and places that you might wish to go to. Palmer's article of the constitutional crisis is particularly good. Nigel Saul's biography of Richard II has some excellent extracts on the threat that was posed to England in 1386 and the wonderful Parliament. The link at the bottom is to an article by Crombie in 2016, which is more from a French perspective about what was happening at this time. And if you have watched the blockbuster film The Last Duel, or you're interested in watching it, that is focused on the end of the year 1386. So that provides some historical context to the talk. So picking up from where we last left off at the end of the Scottish campaign in 1385. So the campaign doesn't yield necessarily any major victories for Richard II, and he does have to return to London without necessarily a battle to show for it or a specific victory that he can call upon. One of the notable consequences of the 1385 Scottish campaign is the now absent John of Gaunt, who's gone to Castile after finding a series of potential he could potentially be the King of Castile after this point. And if you are interested, Helen Carr's biography of John of Gaunt does go into more detail about his movements in 1386 in Castile. But the absence of John of Gaunt is important because he's been a stabilising figure in England, despite the fact that he is seen as a schemer, despite the fact as well that his relationship with Richard is quite fraught. So his absence from this particular point leaves a power vacuum amongst the other lords and members of the nobility as to who's potentially going to be that individual to challenge Richard over his actions towards his favourites. And so in 1386, we have this loomed threat of a French invasion. Now, this doesn't go away for really from the start of the year up until about September of 1386. So it's about 9 months, and there is panic on the streets of London. There's a number of records, particularly from Jean Froissart, so the Flemish chronicler who's writing in France, but also from English chroniclers such as the St Albans Chronicle, that the people of London were panicking, particularly. And there is certainly evidence in 1386 that a large force was assembling in northern France, led by Charles the Bold and the Burgundian contingent over in France, building on the work of the individual who's stylized on the screen, Jean de Vienne. So there clearly is a well-equipped fleet that is ready in the Channel ports, places like Sluis in France, ready to set sail. The Mayor of London, Nicholas Bremborough, a favourite of Richard II, does set a series of proclamations to try and calm the city, and he is relatively successful. There are preparations that are made to make sure that there's stock and supplies of food, and that they're ready potentially for any attack that takes place. But the attack never happens. Now, in July of 1386, the king and the councillors and the people close to him, so his favourites, are worried about this potential invasion, and what they're thinking is, do we strike first? Do we strike and then meet them in the Channel? Do we potentially strike and meet them in France? Or do we wait for them to arrive and attack them? And whatever option that we have to do, we have to have money for it. We've already raised a significant amount of money for the 1385 Scottish campaign, but with this potential threat facing England, money needs to be raised. And that's the context behind why a parliament was called in October of 1386. Now, this parliament has been given a special name, and that parliament's name is the Wonderful Parliament. Now, there's a number of reasons why the people in the Commons, so that's the people in Parliament, would be maybe a little bit annoyed at Richard's favourites at this particular point. We know that Richard has already spent a large sum of money in the 1385 Scottish campaign. We know that he's been angering members of the Commons, members of the nobility, by picking his favourites and elevating them to certain positions. So, for example, Robert de Vere at this point being given that special title of Marquis of Dublin, Marquis of Ireland. But we also have this other issue that starts to crop up from 1385 and 86, where Richard begins to label who his potential successor could be. And the individual in question is Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, who's very young at this point. He's younger than Richard. Now, you can understand why Richard II has chosen the Earl of March. He's younger than him, he's impressionable, he's under his care, he's under his wardship. And in addition, he's not somebody who's challenged him at any point. The line of succession that you can see on the screen suggests why Richard might be justified in selecting the Earl of March. So if you look at the line here, you can see Richard is the eldest son of Edward the Black Prince, who in turn was the eldest son of King Edward III. So you're going back up the line, and what you do is you'd be looking for the next eldest son of the next eldest child, and that potentially would be the next heir to the throne. So if that was the case, you'd take Edward III's second-born son, line of Antwerp, or the Duke of Clarence, and you'd see if he had an eldest child. Unfortunately, he didn't. He had a daughter, but at this time that's not sufficient. So you would then go across even more, and you look at John of Gaunt, and you'd potentially say that he would be the next heir. Or you'd go even further on and look at the Duke of York, or you go on the next uncle, and so on and so forth. So this decision to select the Earl of March at this point, Roger Mortimer, is going to be a contentious one as well, and that's another thing to add to the mix. So Parliament begins on the 1st of October 1386, and this is a year after the last Parliament. And if you are interested, Palmer's article talks about what happened in that 1385 Parliament, which essentially is the same thing, where the Chancellor of the country, in this case Michael Delapole, is asking the Commons, so the senior knights and members of the nobility from across the country, to pay money to the king and to the government so they could launch an expedition. So at the start of the Parliament, Michael Delapole, the Chancellor, he calls for money to be granted in the form of 4/15ths to fight off this potential French invasion. They announce the title of Robert de Vere as Marquis of Ireland, and then the Commons decide enough's enough. They're not going to accept either of those two things, and they're very clear that that French challenge isn't going to materialise now. They've been threatening invasion for a number of months. They've got evidence that it's not going to happen. So this money that's being called is only going to go to the coffers of the government and the king, and it's going to be used for his personal reasons. So they decide at this particular point that they're not having that. And it would be enough, and it would be enough of a record to say that at this point Parliament says no to the king, and we're not accepting that, and we're not accepting these particular terms. But they go even further. They can't say at this point that Richard should leave his position, he's king, but they can certainly attack the person that is meant to be the king's representative in Parliament, the Chancellor, Michael Delapole. And so what they do is they demand that Michael Delapole and the Royal Treasurer, the Bishop of Durham, should be removed from the central government and should be impeached. So essentially charged, put on trial, and removed from office. So impeached means charging somebody who is a public official of crimes of corruption or sedition. Now, what happens next is quite surprising. Richard obviously doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to accept these particular terms. He likes Michael de la Pole. Surprisingly, Michael de la Pole's fairly effective as an administrator and as a bureaucrat. He doesn't want him to leave his position. So Richard's first response to the demands of dismissing Michael de la Pole is one of anger. He's locking horns with these members of the Commons who are saying that Michael de la Pole should leave. What happens is then quite a surprising series of events, and we'll look at this in class. We find that two of the senior lords, so this is the Duke of Gloucester, so that's Richard's youngest uncle, who's also called Thomas of Woodstock, and Thomas Arundel, who's the Bishop of Ely, so he's from the famous Arundel family. These two individuals decide that they're going to have a private conversation with the king at the Parliament. And the Parliament's taking place in the Palace of Eltham. So it's just outside of the city of London at the time. So they have a meeting, and Richard orders the Commons. He says, you need to keep quiet about these matters, and you need to proceed with Parliament's business and hurry up. So essentially, you're going to agree with our demands. You're going to pay the money. You're going to shut up, and we're going to leave this Parliament. And he then makes this really bold claim. He says, I wouldn't remove the lowest kitchen boy from his post just to please you. So you can't tell me who I have to remove from different positions in my government. Now, King's uncle and the Bishop of Ely, they say, look, that's quite a provocative measure. That's quite a stern thing for you to say. And the king then goes even further, and he says that this is a part of a bigger plot to get rid of him. And what he might do is he might even call on his cousin, his colleague, the King of France, to help him. Now, at this point, with Richard saying that he's going to use the King of France against the English people, the king's uncle, Gloucester, and the Bishop of Ely decide that enough's enough. And they have a very stern word with this teenager to make sure that they essentially get their way. So what Gloucester says is, he says, that's a mad idea, and that's going to cause you so many more problems. France is your chief enemy. If you did that, you would potentially cause despoilment in the realm, so you'd cause a civil war, and it could potentially lead to some problems for you particularly. He then issues this threat, and he says that a long time ago, back in 1215, there was a certain king, King John, who acted similar to this, didn't work with his lords and nobles. And what happened is they made sure that he signed a law. He signed a law that would essentially mean that he had to listen to his barons. That law is called the Magna Carta. And what Gloucester says is, as part of that Magna Carta, if the king wasn't going to listen to the barons, the nobles in the country, then it would be acceptable to remove the king from the royal throne and put somebody who would be better suited in his place. So essentially, what the king's uncle's just said is, if you don't follow what we say now, because of the actions that you've just made, we will remove you from your post. So it's a clear intention of war, and the battlegrounds have now been set in England between the favourites and these members of the nobility. So who wins? Well, the king backs down. The king is scared. He's freaked out by this very clear threat that's made by his uncle Gloucester. Richard is really shaken, and so consequently what happens is that the treasurer, Fordham, he's removed from his post, and Michael de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, he's impeached. Now, as part of the impeachment, there's a trial in Parliament. He's sentenced to prison. He's not there for very long. But this is a very, very public event, and everybody knows that the trial of Michael de la Pole isn't about de la Pole, it's about Richard himself. So de la Pole has to forfeit all of the financial gains that were made to him. He has to have all of his titles taken away. And like I say already, he was then imprisoned only for a short period of time. Now that in itself would be a humiliation to Richard. But these lords and nobles go one step further. What they do is they decide that Richard can't be trusted to rule the country effectively, and that the people that he surrounded himself with have been giving him bad counsel and bad advice. So as a result, what they're going to do is something wonderful, which is why it's called the Wonderful Parliament. They reinstate the great and continual councils that were set up when Richard was in his minority. And in these councils, they would have individuals running for 1 year, and they would essentially run the country with the king. So it would be elected amongst the nobles. So it's a bit like having a cabinet that's changing every single year. The three principal people are the Duke of Gloucester, who we've mentioned already, Richard FitzAlan, who's the Earl of Arundel, Thomas Beauchamp, who's the Earl of Warwick. They're the three big individuals who are leading this particular council. There's a number of other individuals that are mentioned, and you can see them on the screen, but these individuals are known as the Appellants. And what they're doing is they have appealed against the king and against the council because they think it's inappropriate. So the three top individuals are now known as the Lords Appellants. And you can see in this particular image that this is when the appellants are speaking with Richard, because this dynamic between the appellants and Richard is one that's going to rumble on for the next 2 years. So in class, we are going to go through this. We're going to go through these events in more detail, but some summary questions for you to think about. Did the Commons act fairly towards Richard and de la Pole based on what's happened in 1385 and 86? And do you think the Commons acted alone? So I'll get you to think about what that might mean. If you've got any questions, please feel free to email me.